The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Wellington penthouse, casting golden shadows across Italian marble floors that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. At 45 stories above Manhattan's Upper East Side, the apartment existed in a realm where money had transformed living space into something approaching art. Crystal chandeliers that had once graced European palaces, Persian rugs worth more than luxury cars, and furniture so carefully curated that each piece told a story of wealth, taste, and the kind of social position that opened doors most people didn't even know existed. But for all its breathtaking beauty, the Wellington penthouse felt hollow in ways that no amount of money could fix. The silence wasn't the peaceful quiet of contentment. It was a heavy, suffocating absence of laughter, of warmth, of the kind of lived-in comfort that transforms a house into a home. This was a showcase, a monument to success, a testament to what 45-year-old Marcus Wellington had built from nothing through brilliance, determination, and the kind of ruthless focus that had made him one of the youngest tech billionaires in the country. Marcus stood at the massive windows overlooking Central Park, his reflection superimposed against the sprawling green landscape below, like a ghost haunting his own success. At 6'1", with prematurely silver hair that added gravity to his still youthful face, he carried himself with the unconscious authority that comes from making decisions that affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his Italian leather shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his platinum watch caught the afternoon light with a kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted its astronomical cost. Everything about Marcus Wellington's appearance suggested a man who had conquered the world and bent it to his will. Everything except his eyes, which carried the hollow exhaustion of someone who discovered that winning the game didn't guarantee happiness, and that some losses couldn't be compensated for with any amount of success. Behind him, curled in a reading chair that was probably worth more than most people's cars, 8-year-old Emma Wellington sat with a book she wasn't reading, her small fingers tracing patterns on velvet upholstery, while her huge brown eyes stared at nothing with a kind of premature seriousness that breaks parents' hearts. She had her mother's delicate features, the same elegant bone structure, the same expressive eyes, the same natural grace that had made Catherine Wellington one of Manhattan's most beloved philanthropists and social figures. But where Catherine had radiated warmth and genuine connection with everyone she met, Emma had retreated into a shell of polite distance that worried everyone who knew her. At 8 years old, she spoke with the formal courtesy of someone much older, maintained perfect posture that suggested she was always being evaluated, and moved through their enormous apartment like a tiny ghost haunting rooms filled with expensive memories. The silence between father and daughter stretched across the apartment's vast spaces like an invisible barrier that neither seemed able to cross. Marcus had built an empire by solving complex problems, by seeing solutions that others missed, by transforming challenges into opportunities through sheer intellectual force. But the problem of connecting with his grieving daughter, of bridging the emotional distance that had grown between them since Catherine's death 18 months ago, seemed beyond the reach of any strategy he could devise. "Emma," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he wasn't sure how his words would be received, "we need to talk about something important." Emma looked up from her book with a kind of polite attention that suggested she was listening not because she was interested, but because good children listen when their parents speak. It was a look that would have seemed perfectly appropriate on the face of a boarding school student or a young diplomat's daughter, and absolutely heartbreaking on an 8-year-old who should have been arguing about bedtime or demanding ice cream for dinner. "Yes, Daddy," she replied, her voice carrying the same formal distance that had characterized most of their conversations since the funeral. The word Daddy sounded almost rehearsed, as if she'd been practicing the role of dutiful daughter rather than simply being one. Marcus crossed the room and settled into the chair across from Emma, noting how she straightened her already perfect posture and folded her hands in her lap like a miniature adult preparing for a business meeting. The gesture reminded him so much of Catherine, who had possessed the same natural elegance, the same ability to command respect through dignity rather than demands, that he felt the familiar stab of grief that still caught him off guard at unexpected moments. "Emma, I know these past months have been difficult, Marcus began, choosing his words with the same precision he used in boardroom negotiations. I know I haven't been the father you needed, and I know you miss Mommy more than words can express. Emma's expression didn't change, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested his words had hit their mark. She nodded once, the gesture conveying acknowledgement rather than agreement, as if she was confirming receipt of information rather than sharing her feelings. I've been thinking, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the slightly uncertain tone that appeared whenever he ventured into emotional territory where his business acumen provided no guidance, about what would make you happy, about what would make our family feel complete again. The word family hung in the air between them, highlighting rather than bridging the distance that grief and guilt had created. They lived in the same apartment, shared meals prepared by hired staff, and maintained the external structure of a household. But neither had figured out how to transform proximity into connection, how to move beyond the careful politeness that had replaced the easy intimacy Catherine had facilitated. Emma waited for him to continue, her patience carrying the kind of adult restraint that no 8-year-old should have needed to develop. She'd learned, through months of watching her father struggle with emotions he couldn't solve like business problems, that showing too much feeling made adults uncomfortable, and that being good, being easy, being no trouble at all was the safest way to navigate a world that had already proven it could take away the people you loved most. I want you to know that you can tell me anything, Marcus said, leaning forward with the intensity he usually reserved for closing major deals. Anything at all that would make you feel better, that would help us be a real family again. If there's something you need, someone you want to spend time with, any way I can make things better for you. He paused, recognizing that he was approaching this conversation like a negotiation where he could offer incentives to achieve desired outcomes, but unsure how else to bridge the gap between his daughter's obvious unhappiness and his own desperate desire to fix whatever was broken between them. Emma studied her father's face with a kind of careful attention that suggested she was evaluating not just his words, but his sincerity, measuring his promises against her experience of how well adults followed through on their commitments to children. Daddy, she said finally, her voice taking on a thoughtful quality that suggested she was considering possibilities rather than simply responding to his questions. What if I told you exactly what would make me happy? What if I knew exactly what would make our family feel right again? Marcus felt a surge of relief that caught him off guard. Finally, a problem his daughter was willing to articulate, a challenge he might actually be able to solve through resources, connections, or sheer determination. Then you tell me, sweetheart, he said, using the endearment that came more naturally than he'd expected. Whatever it is, we'll make it happen. Emma's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of genuine emotion Marcus had seen from her in weeks. Even if it's something really big, even if it's something that might seem unusual. Emma, there's nothing in this world I wouldn't do for you, Marcus replied, the words carrying the absolute conviction of someone who'd built fortunes by refusing to accept limitations. Nothing is too big, nothing is too unusual. You just tell me what you need. Emma nodded slowly, as if she was filing away his promise for future reference, storing his commitment in the careful way children learn to protect themselves when they've discovered that adult promises don't always survive contact with adult convenience. I need a new mommy, Emma said, her words carrying the matter-of-fact directness that children use when stating obvious truths that adults have been dancing around. Not because I don't love Mommy, I'll always love Mommy, but because our family doesn't work with just two people, and because you don't know how to take care of me the way Mommy did. The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each one accurate enough to hurt and honest enough to demand respect rather than defensiveness. Emma was right. He didn't know how to braid her hair or help with homework or have the kind of conversations that turned everyday moments into connections. He'd been a provider, a protector, a presence in the background, while Catherine handled the actual work of parenting. Okay, Marcus said carefully, his mind already racing through possibilities. The elegant women in their social circle who might be suitable, the process of finding someone who could blend seamlessly into their world while providing Emma with the maternal presence she needed. We can explore that possibility. There are several lovely women who might. "No, Daddy," Emma interrupted, her voice taking on the kind of quiet authority that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of Catherine when she'd made decisions that couldn't be negotiated. "You said I could tell you what would make me happy. You said anything at all." Marcus nodded, though he was beginning to sense that this conversation was heading somewhere he hadn't anticipated. "I want to pick her myself," Emma continued, her words gaining strength as she spoke. "I want to walk around and look at people and choose who gets to be my new mommy. Because grown-ups don't always see the things that matter. And I need someone who understands what it's like to be sad and what it's like to need taking care of." Marcus felt his carefully constructed understanding of the situation beginning to shift, recognizing that his 8-year-old daughter was proposing something far more complex and potentially problematic than he'd imagined when he'd made his promise to give her anything she wanted. "Emma, choosing a parent it's not like picking a toy or deciding what to have for dinner," Marcus said, his voice carrying the careful tone adults use when they're trying to redirect children away from impossible requests. "Adults have to want to be part of our family. They have to be appropriate. They have to fit into our life." "You promised," Emma said simply, her words carrying the absolute finality that children deploy when adults try to back away from commitments that have become inconvenient. "You said anything at all. You said nothing was too big or too unusual." Marcus found himself trapped by his own words, caught between his desire to make his daughter happy and his growing recognition that what she was asking for could lead to complications he wasn't prepared to handle. But looking at Emma's face, seeing the first hint of hope he'd witnessed since Catherine's death, he realized that backing down from his promise would do more damage than whatever awkwardness might come from honoring it. "All right," Marcus said, the words feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "We'll do exactly what you want. Tomorrow we'll go out together, and you can look at people and choose whoever you think would be the best new mommy for our family." Emma's face transformed with the first genuine smile Marcus had seen since the funeral, and the sight of his daughter's happiness made him willing to face whatever consequences might come from this unprecedented arrangement. What Marcus couldn't know, as he watched Emma's excitement about their upcoming expedition, was that his daughter's choice would challenge everything he believed about social class, about worth, about what qualified someone to be part of their carefully curated world. He couldn't anticipate that Emma's decision would force him to confront prejudices he didn't even realize he carried, or that it would transform not just their family, but his entire understanding of what mattered in human relationships. The promise had been made, and Marcus Wellington was about to discover that sometimes the most profound changes in life come from keeping commitments that seemed simple when you made them, but turn out to require everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world you built. What this 8-year-old was about to do would expose the difference between a person's bank account and their character, and the choice she made will leave you questioning everything you think you know about what makes someone worthy of love and respect. Before we see how this billionaire's world gets turned completely upside down by his daughter's shocking choice, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because when you see who this little girl points to as her perfect stepmom, you'll want to share this story with everyone you know. Trust me, what happens next will restore your faith in the wisdom of children and the power of seeing people for who they really are. The following morning arrived with a kind of crisp December clarity that made Manhattan's Upper East Side look like a photograph from an expensive travel magazine. Marcus Wellington stood before his walk-in closet, a room larger than most New York apartments, selecting what he hoped would be appropriate attire for the most unusual shopping expedition of his life. He settled on charcoal wool slacks, a cashmere sweater, and an overcoat that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, reasoning that whatever happened during their outing, he should at least look like someone who belonged in the social circles where he expected Emma to make her selection. Emma emerged from her room wearing a burgundy velvet dress with matching coat, her hair pulled back in the kind of elegant style that made her look like a miniature socialite preparing for afternoon tea. But there was something different about her this morning, an alertness, an energy that Marcus hadn't seen since before Catherine's death. She moved with purpose rather than the listless politeness that had characterized her behavior for the past 18 months. "Ready, Daddy?" Emma asked, her voice carrying genuine excitement for the first time in months. Marcus nodded, though internally he was rehearsing the careful explanations he'd prepared for the women he expected Emma to consider. Victoria Ashworth, the elegant art gallery owner who'd been widowed 2 years earlier and had shown subtle interest in deepening their friendship. Rebecca Morrison, the accomplished attorney who'd handled Catherine's estate with both professional competence and personal sensitivity. Sarah Chun, the sophisticated curator at the Metropolitan Museum who shared Catherine's passion for philanthropy and cultural preservation. All 3 women moved in their social circle, understood the expectations that came with the Wellington name, and possessed the kind of refined education and cultural background that would make the transition seamless. Marcus had even prepared a mental script for approaching the conversation, explaining Emma's unusual request, while making it clear that any relationship would develop naturally over time, that this was about providing his daughter with positive female role models, rather than rushing into anything inappropriate. As their private car navigated through Manhattan traffic, Marcus felt cautiously optimistic about the day ahead. Emma's method might be unconventional, but her choices would surely reflect the world she'd been raised in, the values Catherine had instilled, and the natural understanding that some social boundaries existed for good reasons. "Where would you like to start looking?" Marcus asked as they emerged from their building onto the sidewalk, expecting Emma to suggest Madison Avenue boutiques, the upscale restaurants where their social circle gathered for lunch, or perhaps the cultural institutions where accomplished women of their class typically spent their time. Instead, Emma looked up and down the street with a careful assessment of someone conducting a scientific survey rather than making social calls. "I want to walk," she said simply. "I want to see people." Marcus felt his first twinge of unease at Emma's phrasing. See people suggested a broader scope than he'd anticipated, but he reasoned that their neighborhood provided plenty of appropriate options. The Upper East Side was populated with exactly the kind of women who would understand their lifestyle, their expectations, and their social obligations. They began walking down Fifth Avenue, past designer boutiques, where holiday shoppers moved with the unhurried confidence of people for whom price tags were suggestions rather than limitations. Marcus pointed out several elegantly dressed women who caught his attention: a stunning brunette examining jewelry at Tiffany, a sophisticated blonde selecting scarves at Hermes, a graceful redhead browsing art books at a gallery. Each time, Emma would study his suggestions with a kind of serious consideration that made Marcus think she was evaluating his recommendations according to criteria he didn't understand. But after watching each woman for several minutes, Emma would shake her head with polite finality and continue walking. "What exactly are you looking for, sweetheart?" Marcus asked after Emma had rejected the 5th obviously suitable candidate, a physician's widow who volunteered at the Children's Hospital and had known Catherine through charitable work. "I'll know when I see her," Emma replied, her voice carrying the mysterious certainty that children sometimes display when they understand things adults have overlooked. As they continued their walk, Marcus began to notice things about Emma's observation process that hadn't been apparent initially. She wasn't just looking at women's appearances, their clothing, or their obvious social markers. She was studying interactions, how people treated service workers, how they responded to homeless individuals asking for spare change, how they behaved when they thought no one was watching. When a well-dressed woman snapped impatiently at a street vendor who didn't speak perfect English, Emma watched with disapproving attention. When another elegant lady stepped around a homeless veteran without acknowledgement, Emma's expression grew thoughtful in ways that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. They'd been walking for nearly 2 hours, moving steadily away from the exclusive shops and refined restaurants of their usual territory, when Emma's pace began to slow. They were approaching the edge of the Upper East Side, where the demographics shifted and the carefully maintained perfection of Marcus's world began to fray around the edges. "Emma," Marcus said, his voice taking on the gentle firmness he used when steering business meetings back toward productive territory. "Maybe we should head back toward the areas where we're more likely to find someone who would be compatible with our lifestyle." Emma looked up at him with an expression that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of Catherine when she'd been about to challenge his assumptions in ways that would prove her point while making him question his own judgment. "Daddy," Emma said, her voice carrying the patient tone children use when explaining obvious truths to adults who should know better. You said I could pick anyone. You promised that nothing was too unusual. Marcus felt the trap closing around him as he recognized his own words being used to justify a direction he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure he could handle. Of course, sweetheart. I just want to make sure we're being practical about this. What does practical mean? Emma asked, though her tone suggested she understood exactly what he meant and was challenging him to say it out loud. Marcus struggled to find words that would redirect their search without revealing the prejudices he was only beginning to recognize in himself. Well, it means finding someone who understands our world, who would be comfortable in our home, who shares our values and background. So someone who looks like us? Emma asked, her 8-year-old directness cutting through his careful euphemisms with surgical precision. That's not what I meant, Marcus said quickly, though he was beginning to realize that it might be exactly what he'd meant without admitting it to himself. Emma nodded as if she'd confirmed something she'd suspected all along. Good, she said, because I don't think looking like us is what makes someone a good mommy. The words hung between them as they continued walking, and Marcus found himself hoping that whatever choice Emma eventually made would fall within the boundaries of what he could accept without challenging everything he'd built his identity around. He had no idea that those boundaries were about to be tested in ways that would force him to examine not just his assumptions about appropriate partners, but his fundamental beliefs about human worth, social class, and what qualified someone to be part of his carefully constructed world. What this billionaire was about to discover about his own prejudices would shake him to his core, and the choice his 8-year-old daughter was preparing to make would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, family, and what really mattered in the people we choose to trust with our hearts. But for now, Marcus walked beside his daughter through streets that were leading them further from the world he knew and closer to a revelation that would change both their lives forever. By the time they reached the subway entrance at 86th and Lexington, Marcus Wellington felt like he was entering foreign territory despite having lived in Manhattan for over 2 decades. This wasn't the carefully curated world of private cars and exclusive establishments where he conducted his daily life. This was the grittier, more authentic version of the city where real people navigated real struggles without the insulation that wealth provided. The December afternoon had grown colder, and the foot traffic had shifted from leisure shoppers to commuters, workers, and residents whose relationship with the city was defined by necessity rather than choice. Marcus found himself unconsciously adjusting his posture, becoming more aware of his expensive overcoat, his Italian leather shoes, and the way his obvious wealth made him stand out in an environment where most people were focused on getting from one place to another with maximum efficiency and minimum expense. Emma, however, seemed to come alive as they moved through this more diverse landscape. Her steps quickened. Her head turned constantly to observe the people around them. And for the first time since they'd begun their unusual expedition, Marcus saw genuine interest in her expression rather than polite assessment. There, Emma said suddenly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd found exactly what they'd been looking for. Marcus followed his daughter's gaze toward a woman sitting on a small folded blanket near the subway entrance, positioned carefully out of the main flow of pedestrian traffic, but visible to anyone passing by. At first glance, she appeared to be what Marcus would have categorized as one of the city's homeless population, someone to avoid eye contact with, to walk around, to acknowledge with a kind of uncomfortable awareness that came from knowing you should care but weren't sure how to help. But as Marcus looked more closely, prompted by Emma's obvious interest, he began to notice details that contradicted his initial assessment. The woman was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail despite her circumstances. Her clothes were clean but worn, layered for warmth rather than fashion, and her small cardboard sign was written in careful script that suggested education rather than desperation. Not asking for much, the sign read, "Just enough to keep going. Former nurse. Any kindness appreciated." The woman, who would later introduce herself as Sarah Chun, sat with her back straight despite her position on the sidewalk, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm rather than pleading. She made eye contact with passers-by without the aggressive desperation that Marcus associated with panhandling, offering instead a gentle nod of acknowledgement that suggested dignity maintained despite difficult circumstances. What struck Marcus most forcefully was how she interacted with the people who stopped to help her. When a construction worker dropped a few dollars in her small container, she thanked him by name. Apparently, she'd learned the names of her regular contributors. When an elderly woman paused to ask if she needed food, Sarah's response was gracious and specific rather than generically grateful. "Emma," Marcus said carefully, recognizing that his daughter's interest in this woman represented exactly the kind of complication he'd been hoping to avoid. "I think maybe we should continue looking. There might be better options." But Emma was already walking toward Sarah with a kind of purposeful movement that suggested she'd made a decision that wouldn't be easily changed. Marcus followed reluctantly, his mind racing through the social impossibilities of what his daughter seemed to be contemplating. "Hello," Emma said, settling onto the sidewalk next to Sarah with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been taught that certain types of people were supposed to be avoided. Sarah looked surprised by Emma's approach, then concerned as she noticed Marcus hovering nearby with obvious discomfort. "Hello, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the warmth that came naturally to people who'd worked with children. "Shouldn't you be with your daddy?" "I am with my daddy," Emma said, gesturing toward Marcus. "We're looking for someone." Sarah's expression grew more cautious as she processed the unusual nature of this interaction. "Looking for someone? Are you lost?" "No," Emma said with the matter-of-fact directness that had been characterizing all her conversations lately. "We're looking for a new mommy for me. My old mommy died, and Daddy doesn't know how to take care of me properly." The words hung in the air with the kind of brutal honesty that only children could deliver, creating a moment of stunned silence as Sarah processed what she'd just heard. "Oh, honey," Sarah said, her voice immediately softening with the kind of empathy that came from understanding loss personally. "I'm so sorry about your mommy. That must be very hard." Marcus watched in fascination as his daughter's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly in response to Sarah's genuine sympathy. For the first time in months, Emma was talking to someone who seemed to understand that her grief was real, that her loss mattered, that her feelings deserved acknowledgement rather than careful management. "It is hard," Emma admitted, her voice taking on the vulnerability that Marcus hadn't heard since Catherine's funeral. "Daddy tries, but he doesn't know about braiding hair or making breakfast that isn't just cereal, or what to do when I have bad dreams." Sarah nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen children struggle with loss before. "Those are important things," she agreed. "Taking care of someone means knowing what they need, not just what they want." "Exactly," Emma said, her face lighting up with the recognition that someone finally understood what she'd been trying to communicate to the adults in her life. "Do you know about taking care of children?" Sarah's expression grew complex as she considered how to answer honestly without encouraging what was clearly an impossible situation. "I used to," she said carefully. "I worked as a pediatric nurse for several years. I took care of lots of children who were scared or hurt or missing their families." "What happened?" Emma asked with the direct curiosity that children use when they want real answers rather than adult deflections. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving between Emma's eager face and Marcus's obvious discomfort. "Sometimes life changes in ways you don't expect," she said finally. "Sometimes you lose things that matter to you, and you have to figure out how to start over." The connection between Sarah and Emma was immediate and genuine in ways that made Marcus profoundly uncomfortable. He could see his daughter responding to something in this woman, a quality of attention, of understanding, of authentic care that had nothing to do with social status or appropriate credentials. "Emma," Marcus said, his voice carrying the gentle firmness he used when business meetings needed to be redirected, "we should probably continue our search. I'm sure this lady has things she needs to do." "Actually," Emma said, looking up at her father with an expression that reminded him uncomfortably of Catherine when she'd made decisions that weren't open to negotiation, "I think I found her." The words hit Marcus like physical blows as he realized that his 8-year-old daughter was seriously considering choosing a homeless woman to be her stepmother. Everything about the situation violated his understanding of appropriate boundaries, social possibilities, and practical realities. But looking at Emma's face, seeing the first genuine happiness he'd witnessed since Catherine's death, Marcus found himself trapped between his instinctive rejection of this impossible choice and his growing recognition that his daughter had found something in this stranger that she hadn't found in any of the obviously suitable women they'd encountered earlier. Sarah looked between father and daughter with growing understanding of the complexity of what was happening. "Sweetheart," she said gently to Emma, "I think there might be some confusion about what you're looking for. Choosing a family is much more complicated than—" "I know exactly what I'm looking for," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had been appearing more frequently as she asserted her own understanding of what she needed. "I'm looking for someone who knows about taking care of people who are sad. Someone who understands what it's like to lose important things. Someone who doesn't pretend that having money makes everything okay." The accuracy of Emma's assessment hit Marcus like a revelation he wasn't prepared to handle. His daughter had articulated exactly what was missing from their carefully constructed life: authentic human connection that transcended social performance and economic status. What this billionaire was about to learn about his own assumptions would shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew about worth, value, and what qualified someone to be part of his family. The conversation you're about to witness will expose the difference between a person's circumstances and their character. And the choice his daughter makes next will prove that sometimes the most precious gifts come in the most unexpected packages. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching his 8-year-old daughter sit cross-legged next to a homeless woman, engaged in the kind of genuine conversation he hadn't been able to have with Emma since Catherine's death. The contrast was staggering. His perfectly dressed daughter in her velvet coat worth more than most people's monthly salary, chatting easily with someone society had taught him to categorize as invisible. "Emma," Marcus said, his voice carrying the careful authority he used when business negotiations needed to be concluded, "we need to go home now. We can discuss this more privately." But Emma looked up at him with an expression that reminded him powerfully of Catherine during their early courtship, when she challenged his assumptions about philanthropy, social responsibility, and what it meant to use wealth for good rather than just accumulation. "Daddy," Emma said, her voice taking on the patient tone children use when explaining obvious truths to adults who should understand better. "You promised I could choose anyone. You said nothing was too unusual." Sarah watched this exchange with growing concern, clearly recognizing that she'd somehow become the center of a family crisis she didn't understand. "Listen," she said gently, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I appreciate your daughter's kindness, but choosing a family is much more complicated than—" "Why?" Emma interrupted, turning to face Sarah with the direct curiosity that had been driving all her decisions that day. "Because you don't have money? Because you don't live in a big apartment? Because you don't look like the ladies Daddy knows?" The questions hung in the air like accusations that couldn't be deflected, forcing Marcus to confront the uncomfortable truth that his 8-year-old daughter understood his prejudices better than he did. "Emma, it's not about—" Marcus began, then stopped as he realized he couldn't finish that sentence without revealing exactly what it was about. "Mr. Wellington," Sarah said, and Marcus was surprised to realize she'd recognize his name, "your daughter is very special. But I'm not in a position to be anyone's mother right now. I'm just trying to get back on my feet." "What happened to your feet?" Emma asked with the literal mindedness that sometimes cut through adult euphemisms to reach uncomfortable truths. Sarah smiled despite herself. "I lost my job at the hospital when they cut the pediatric program. Lost my apartment when I couldn't pay rent. Sometimes life changes faster than you can adapt to it." Marcus found himself listening with growing attention as Sarah's story emerged through Emma's relentless questioning. She'd been a pediatric nurse for 8 years, had lost her position due to budget cuts, had exhausted her savings trying to stay afloat while searching for new employment in an oversaturated job market. "But you still know how to take care of children?" Emma pressed. "I do," Sarah admitted. "It's what I trained for, what I love doing." Emma turned to her father with the expression of someone presenting an obvious solution to a simple problem. "See? She knows exactly what I need, and I can help her get her feet back." The innocent misunderstanding of Sarah's metaphor would have been amusing under different circumstances. But Marcus found himself trapped between his daughter's logic and his own social conditioning. "Emma, it's not that simple," Marcus said, though he was beginning to realize that maybe it was exactly that simple, and his complications were all self-imposed. "Why not?" Emma asked. "We have extra rooms. We have money to help people. Mommy always said we should use what we have to make things better." The invocation of Catherine's values hit Marcus like a physical blow, reminding him that his late wife had spent her life challenging exactly the kind of social barriers he was now instinctively defending. Marcus looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time, and saw not a homeless person to be avoided, but a professional who'd been derailed by circumstances beyond her control. Someone with skills, experience, and the kind of genuine warmth Emma had been missing since Catherine's death. "What if," Marcus heard himself saying, "we approach this differently? What if instead of what Emma's suggesting, we talked about employment? A position as Emma's nanny, with fair compensation, proper accommodation?" Sarah's eyes widened with surprise. "Mr. Wellington, I appreciate the gesture, but I couldn't accept charity." "It wouldn't be charity," Marcus said, his business mind finally catching up with his daughter's emotional intelligence. "Emma needs someone who understands children, who can provide the kind of care I obviously can't. You need stable employment in your field. This could be mutually beneficial." Emma clapped her hands with delight. "See? I told you she was perfect." Sarah looked between father and daughter, clearly struggling to process how a morning of sitting on a sidewalk had led to a conversation about employment with one of the city's most prominent families. "I would need references, background checks, proper interviews," Marcus continued, his practical nature reasserting itself. "This would have to be done correctly, professionally." "Of course," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet dignity that had impressed Emma from the beginning. "I have references from the hospital, from families I worked with. I may be homeless, but I'm not unprofessional." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same penthouse windows where this story began, watching Emma and Sarah work on homework together at the dining room table. Sarah had moved into the guest suite after passing every background check and interview with flying colors. She'd re-enrolled in continuing education courses, had helped Emma process her grief in ways Marcus never could have managed, and had brought warmth back to an apartment that had felt like a museum since Catherine's death. "Daddy," Emma called from the table, "Sarah says I can help plan the wedding if you ever decide to ask her to marry you properly." Marcus felt his face flush as both Emma and Sarah laughed at his obvious embarrassment. The relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than Emma's initial 8-year-old certainty about instant family creation. "We'll see about that," Marcus said, though he was already thinking about ring shopping and how to propose to someone who taught him that love wasn't about finding someone who fit your world, but about expanding your world to include someone worth loving. Did you see how this little girl's wisdom completely transformed her father's understanding of what makes someone family material? The wedding that followed 2 years later proved that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with a child's pure heart seeing what adults miss. This incredible journey from prejudice to understanding shows us that worth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the kindness we show each other when life gets hard. If this story of unexpected love and second chances touched your heart and reminded you to look for the good in unexpected places, hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories of human connection that will restore your faith in people. Drop a comment telling me about a time someone surprised you with their character. And check out our playlist of similar stories that prove love and kindness always triumph over prejudice and assumptions. Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose based on who people really are, not what they appear to be. And Emma Wellington's choice that December day changed 3 lives forever by proving that real love sees beyond circumstances to find the character that matters most.